Hi, everyone. So one of the important topics in Chapter 2 has to do with the politics around the time of founding our country and getting to our Constitution. So our first Constitution was the Articles of Confederation. This was adopted by the Continental Congress in 1777. It was ratified by all of the states in 1781. And the government just consisted of a legislature, so just Congress. There was no executive branch and no judicial branch. And each state had a single vote. Congress was weak. It had no ability to levy taxes, no ability to regulate commerce. It couldn't really enforce its laws. It could pass laws, but then it was up to the states to actually enforce them. And as your textbook points out, this is kind of similar to the relationship today between the United Nations and member governments. So the United Nations can pass resolutions, but it really is up to individual countries to actually carry them out. So think about this. This is a topic we still argue about today. Is our national government, is our federal government too strong? Is it too weak? Think about the pros and cons of this. Like, what is the benefit of having a very weak central government as opposed to some problems that might come along? So one way to think about this is in the framework of the basic foundations of government that we talked about in Chapter 1. So when it comes to the means of coercion, Congress really didn't have this. So Congress could pass laws, but they had to rely on states to implement them. And there was no way to coordinate activity among the states or to get everyone working towards a common goal. How about the means of collecting revenue? Again, Congress could ask for revenue. They could ask for soldiers for national defense, but it was up to the states to comply or not. And states might decide if it was a problem that wasn't really near their state's borders, why should they send money or send troops? And the third question is legitimacy. The government didn't have traditional legitimacy. That's the idea that, it could be based on a royal family, or it could be based on history, on the idea that it's always been done this way. It also didn't have the ability to claim legitimacy based on popular consent. So the national legislature at this time wasn't chosen directly by the people. It was chosen by each state legislature, who again sent one representative. So there was indirect consent, but it could feel like a disconnect to the citizens. So there were some obvious problems under the Articles of Confederation. So meanwhile, in 1783, Great Britain signed a treaty to formally recognize American independence. And a few years later, we have what they call the Second Founding. So our Constitutional Convention was held in 1787. And so some of the key issues that the delegates had to deal with: first, should you revise the Articles of Confederation, or were they just so, not working that they just needed to scrap them and really start from scratch? They had to resolve the question of the balance between national power and state power. They had to resolve the question of just how much democracy did they want in whatever new system they created. They had to figure out how to allocate representation in a national legislature, and they had to deal with the problem of slavery. So right off the bat, the delegates decided that just revising the Articles of Confederation wouldn't be enough. They decided to just start over and write a whole new constitution. And one of the things that was very, very contentious in these debates was how to allocate representation. As you know, at the time of our 13 colonies, our first 13 states, they had some that were very large and some that were very small. And a system where every state got one vote gives more power to the smaller states, and the larger states felt that that wasn't really fair because they had more people, they had a larger economy, so they should have more say. You saw at this time what was called the Virginia Plan, which was put forward by Virginia, and this plan proposed that representation in the national legislature should be based on each state's population. You might expect Virginia was one of the larger states. So states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Massachusetts really liked this idea. They were the larger states at the time. The competing plan was known as the New Jersey Plan. So smaller states liked this plan because it argued that each state should continue to be equally represented in the legislature. So small states liked that plan. The way they resolved this was what is now called the Great Compromise. And the compromise was, let's come up with a way to make the large states and the small states happy. And the way they did it was to have a bicameral legislature. That means a legislature with two chambers. We have our House of Representatives, which is based on population, and we have our Senate, which gives each state an equal share. So great, the Great Compromise. The other issue that was very, very difficult was slavery. And the dispute really was not about whether slavery was right or wrong. That wasn't the thing they were arguing about. They were arguing about whether slaves should be counted in terms of population. So if you were going to allocate seats in the House of Representatives based on population, obviously the slaveholding states would like the slaves to be counted as part of that. The non-slaveholding states said, well, that's ridiculous. You don't let them vote, so why should they be counted? What they eventually came up with was called the 3/5 compromise. So this is kind of infamous. Each slave was counted as 3/5 of a person. And this was for the purposes of allocating the number of seats in the House of Representatives. They got 0/5 of a vote, but in terms of counting up population, they were counted as 3/5. And if you have the slightest familiarity with American history, you know this is something that has continued to have negative effects. It's an ongoing legacy that we haven't fully dealt with yet. Okay, so let's look at what the framers were trying to do when writing the Constitution. They were trying to achieve several different goals at once. They were trying to create a strong government, but at the same time, put in some mechanisms to prevent abuse of government power. They were also trying to prevent what they talked about at the time as excessive democracy. But at the same time, they were trying to have just enough democracy to gain legitimacy and popular support. So it was this real complicated balancing act. They were trying to do all of these things at once. Let's look in a little more detail about all of these goals and the institutions that were coming out of them. So first, creating a strong government. The framers believed government needed to be strong enough to protect property, to coordinate activity among the states, and to enact laws that would make the nation as a whole stronger. It makes sense that when the Articles of Confederation were written, the concern at that time was limiting government power. They had just gained independence and were concerned about setting up a brand new monarchy. But after a few years, it became clear that the Articles of Confederation created a government that was too weak to deal with serious problems facing the country. The end of the war left America in a state of economic crisis. So trade had been disrupted, farmers were struggling to deal with the damage from years of war, and the Articles of Confederation were so weak that instead of being able to promote the national economy, you had a situation where states were actually enacting competitive tariffs against each other. So this was causing conflict between states and slowing down economic growth. So the institutions that come out of this concern with making government strong enough to deal with problems, include national control over commerce, the Supremacy Clause, a strong presidency, and national judicial supremacy. But while they wanted government to be stronger than it was, they did not want to go too far and create a government strong enough to abuse its power. So in the second goal, institutions that you see trying to prevent abuse of government power include separation of powers and federalism. A third major goal had to do with preventing excessive democracy. So there was a big concern among the framers that ordinary people shouldn't have too much ability to put bad ideas into action. They had this idea that elites would make better decisions. They wouldn't be led astray by selfishness. They would, have more education to think through the consequences of different policies. And so there were some mechanisms to kind of filter ideas that came from, the masses or the mob. These institutions include checks and balances, staggered terms in office, indirect elections, and lifetime appointment for judges. But at the same time, they wanted to make sure that the new government being created by the Constitution did have popular support and legitimacy. So the institution that came out of that concern was direct popular election for the House of Representatives. Also, members of the House served for only 2 years, so they could be held accountable by the voters. They had a short term in office, and if the voters felt they weren't listening or weren't representing their interests, they could vote for someone else. So this was kind of a lot of different considerations, a lot of goals trying to be accomplished, all in one document. I'll finish this up with some questions. First, what were some specific reasons the founders feared excessive democracy? So you should be able to find some more answers to that reading over the chapter in the textbook. Second, you should be able to choose an institution from the list on the previous slide and explain how it works. And then third, answer how this institution balances representation with effective governance. So that is another balancing act that a government has to try to accomplish. So be able to answer these questions, and this will give us lots to discuss. All right, have a good day. We'll stop here for now.